author of The Real James Bond. That's why you're here, right? But that's only part of a much bigger and more prolific story, much of which, not surprisingly, involves birding. Jim has been the birding columnist for The Record in northern New Jersey for the past 11 years, and he was Bergen County Audubon Society's Conservationist of the Year for 2012. He's lived next to the Celery Farm Natural Area, which is an Audubon important bird area in New Jersey, for more than 16 years, and he blogs about his experiences there and nearby at celeryfarm.net. Look it up, celeryfarm.net. He has a separate blog. You will not be surprised to hear the name is realjamesbond.net, where you can go to order hardcover and signed copies of The Real James Bond and Kindle and Apple editions, and read reviews of the book, including one from the Wall Street Journal, and see updates about new things about James Bond the ornithologist, including a recent one that I love where he says, and I quote, "The 25th 007 movie, No Time to Die, has been moved back again to next April, which makes one wonder if the name should be changed to No Time to Release." Jim has also written several other books, including The Nature of the Meadowlands, Hawk Mountain, Jungle of the Maya, and In the Presence of Nature, a coffee table book about the celery farm. But tonight he's with us virtually, live from New Jersey, to talk about Bond, the real James Bond. So you have the floor, Jim.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll get started. Okay, so I'm going to talk about The Real James Bond, Rare Birds, and a Nest of Spies. And I wanted to thank you guys, the Evanston North Shore Bird Club and Lake Cook Audubon, for inviting me. It's I wish I could be there in person, but even being there via Zoom is a treat. I also want to thank Sonny Cohen for helping with all the technical aspects. I've done quite a few Zoom talks now, and it's usually Murphy's Law. So if something goes wrong tonight, it's probably my fault, not Sonny's. But thank you for that, Sonny.
You're welcome.
So I guess the question and one of the reasons I wrote the book is, are you a birder or a bonder? I bet most people watching tonight are birders, but probably a spouse or two might be a bonder and are there just out of curiosity what the relationship is. Rita mentioned the movie being postponed, and originally it was supposed to be released last November, and I would have spoken to you a year ago, and since then the movie's been postponed to April and then November, and now next April again. So I'm not sure when it's ever gonna come out, but we shall find out. One of the things, if you're a birder or a bonder, is I think there's actually a lot more cross-pollination than you think. And if you read Ian Fleming's novels, he was a big birder himself, and he writes about birds quite a bit in his novels. You'd be surprised. So a little about me. Like James Bond, I'm a Philly boy. Like James Bond, the real James Bond, I go by Jim. I'm 6'2". I'm part Scottish, and my middle name begins with a B. So I always say I was destined to write this book. Here are some of the books I've written. One nearest my heart is In the Presence of Nature. I'm a deputy marsh warden at the Celery Farm Natural Area. It's right out my window. And I was doing an interview today, and I thought I saw an eagle perched, and I couldn't say anything. So it's one of the occupational hazards, I guess, of living next to a natural area, and one of the benefits. I'd like to say a little about the cover, because Molly Shields of Schiffer Publishing designed this cover, and when they sent me the sample, I was delighted. They called the guy on the cover the Birdman, and you have to be a pretty good birder, I think, to identify the bird head, and that is a Cuban green woodpecker, and of course that is actually my body, a little known fact. And the other little known fact is that this isn't the first James Bond to have a bird disguise. And I'd like to share this with you, give you a feeling for 007 and James Bond. This is the opening to Goldfinger. This is an excellent disguise, as you'll find out here. That's an odd looking gull, isn't it? And that's where they got the term gullible, I believe. So a little about the book. It is all about everything you need to know about the real James Bond and a lot about 007. It is amply illustrated with a lot of pretty cool pictures I spent a long time digging up. My favorite is probably on the upper right there. It's a paperback version of For Your Eyes Only. And you probably didn't notice, but there's actually a red-billed streamer tail on the cover as well. And the short story For Your Eyes Only begins with 300 words by Ian Fleming describing the red-billed streamer tail. So little known fact, but for you birders out there, it's really beautifully written. So I've achieved 3 of my goals already. First was getting the book published. When you start an enterprise like this, you're never sure what's gonna come of it, but you keep plugging along. But the book came out right when the COVID crisis hit. And nonetheless, I got a very nice write-up in the Wall Street Journal. And I think they called it a slim and elegant biography, which I thought sounded pretty good to me. But the really big achievement was I made the British tabloids. Back in January, the Daily Mirror's Sunday paper had a Sunday section, People, and they did up the real James Bond Wright. The subhead there says 007 creator stole the name of naturalist, who also had a license to kill birds. And the little blurb at the bottom says, his wife answered and said, this is pussy galore. So they pulled out all the stops for this. I was a little disappointed that I wasn't on the cover of the magazine, but there's 2 women named Kate and Megan on the cover, and I don't know who they are, but I think they are British ornithologists. One of the goals of the book was to show ornithologists in a different light. James Bond typically looked kind of stodgy, and I'll show you a picture in a minute or two. But Julie Zickafoos wrote a little blurb for the book and said, if the book does nothing more than change the stereotype of ornithologists as being stodgy and dull, it will have done a great service. So I hope I've taken a step in that direction. So here are 2 pictures of James Bond. They're the ones you usually see. And if you want to see a stereotypical bird ornithologist guy, it's James Bond on the left. He's wearing a bow tie, smoking a pipe, holding 2 dead birds, wearing glasses, and wearing a suit. And that's what people think of when they think of ornithologists, not the picture before with James Bond with a double-barreled shotgun. The picture on the right is the one from Wikipedia. And in that picture, Bond is in his 70s or 80s. And he looks to me like an undertaker or someone who's on the way to the undertaker. So I wanted to change the image of James Bond in particular and ornithologists in general. And I was going through the archives at the Free Library of Philadelphia, of the James Bond archives, and found this picture of Jim Bond when he was 50, I think. And the guy looks like a movie star. And I read his wife's description of him. He says, he's more handsome than Sean Connery any day. And I thought she was kind of loony, but you see pictures like that, and he was a pretty handsome guy. So I wanted to give you a taste of the book, and I was delighted this fall. Schiffer Publishing has done an audiobook version. You can get it on Audible, and they hired a British narrator named Raphael Corkhill. And here's a taste of the book.
Introduction. A spy is born. The name of a man is a numbing blow from which he never recovers. Marshall McLuhan, Understanding Media. This is the story of the most notorious case of identity theft in history. Long before Ian Lancaster Fleming became a best-selling author, a single-minded Philadelphia ornithologist named James Bond wrote Birds of the West Indies, based on repeated expeditions to the Bahamas and the Caribbean from 1927 to 1935. The 480-page book, published in 1936, featured black and white line drawings of birds by noted artist Earl Poole. It quickly became the must-have book on the subject. Fast forward to early 1952. Fleming was starting to flesh out his maiden 007 novel, Casino Royale, and needed a name for his imaginary secret agent. As he would often do when inventing characters for his books, Fleming simply lifted a name from real life. He looked at the distinctive white dust jacket of Birds of the West Indies on his bookshelf, noted the author's name in capital letters, and took it. James Bond. Period. No middle name, not even a middle initial. Just 9 purloined letters. A spy was born.
So I just love the way he reads that. It's quite a kick for an author to hear his words read. So I hope you don't mind me playing it. The one thing when I started researching Bond, I had no idea how rich he was as a kid. And you're pretty rich. That's a painting of James Bond as a kid. So you know he's pretty rich if his family is paying to have portraits done of him. His father was a founding member of E.B. Smith and Company, which later became Smith Barney, which made money the old-fashioned way. They earned it. And he was really rich. He actually was a part owner of the Philadelphia Phillies for a while. On the left is Margaret Roebling Bond, and James Bond's on the right, and the brother Francis in the middle. Well, as you may have guessed, Margaret Bond, middle name Roebling, was of the Brooklyn Bridge building Roeblings, and she had a ton of money as well. But as happens, all the money in the world can't prevent tragedies or spare you from tragedies. And when Bond was 4, his older sister died, I think, of a ruptured appendix in Maine, and her father actually hired a train and a special yacht to get up to see her before she died. The family never really recovered, and they had been living in downtown Philadelphia, and they decided they would kind of drown their troubles by building an estate, and they called it Willowbrook, 250 acres, and that is the main house right there. And to show you how big the house was, you're looking at the administration building of Gwynedd Mercy University. And the campus was Bond's old house and his old estate. So that's the kind of money he came from. Tragically, his mother died when Bond was 12, and his father quickly remarried a British widow and gave her Willowbrook as a wedding present. They then took the boys overseas, and Jim Bond went to Harrow, and people, when he was older, didn't quite understand his accent, but it turned out he went to the British boarding school at Harrow. Then he went to Trinity College, Cambridge, for 4 years as well. And when I did my research, one of the teachers at Harrow took a picture of Jim Bond's name, which is still carved on the wall at Harrow, and he is one of their illustrious alumni. After Harrow, Bond went to Cambridge. As I'd mentioned, he studied finance and later got a job as a banker in Philadelphia, and he absolutely hated it. And he came into a small inheritance, and he decided if he invested his money very carefully and lived like a pauper, then he could do what he really wanted to do. And he got a job with the Academy of Natural Sciences. I forgot to mention that Bond's uncle also had a ton of money, and his name is Carroll Tyson. And his artwork is collected all over the country. It's in the White House collection. He's famed for his birds of Mount Desert Island, patterned after Audubon's birds. And it turns out that just as Audubon used to shoot the birds that he painted, the family legend has it that Jim Bond shot all the birds that Carroll Tyson painted in his Birds of Mount Desert Island. And a painting like that snowy owl, if you have a fine arts print of that, it's worth many, many thousands of dollars. They're really collected, especially on Mount Desert Island. Bond and his uncle also collaborated on a book called The Birds of Mount Desert Island and Acadia National Park. And I love the description of the common crow. It's not your average bird guide. He says common crow is well known and widespread on Mount Desert Island, where it is jokingly called by some natives soup meat. So you don't see many field guides with a sense of humor like that. And I think that was more James Bond's uncle that did that. But James Bond's uncle is more famous for not a painting or a fine arts print that he did, but a painting that he owned. And he had so much money, he'd go to Europe and buy impressionist paintings. He saw Sunflowers by Vincent van Gogh and decided he had to have it, brought it home and had second thoughts. And family lore has it that he hung the painting behind his seat at the dining room table so he wouldn't have to look at it. And that is really wealthy. The good news is that after he died, his family donated sunflowers to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And you can go to the rotunda there, and that is the big pride and joy of the Philadelphia Museum of Art on display in this rotunda. And it's there for everyone to see. So Bond, after college, didn't like being a banker. He took a job with the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences, where he became an ornithologist. He was self-taught and just, you know, he was like a savant when it came to birds. And I think we all know people like that. But he decided early on that he wanted to spend his career studying the birds of the West Indies. And as you can see, that is a lot of islands, and he would travel there whenever he could. And since he didn't have much money, he traveled by mail ships, typically because you could get on and get off from like a jitney in a tour bus in a city, and you could go from island to island, spend three months there, and just hop on the next mail ship and go to the next island. And when he got between islands, he would often be taking banana boats, rum runners, you name it. However he could get from island to island, he would. When he got to the islands, he would travel on foot or on horseback, often alone. He slept in huts, in hammocks. This is a shot from the Zapata Swamp in Cuba, and that's where he stayed when he was there for 3 months, tracking down some of the rare Zapata birds. Some of the tools of his trade included arsenic to preserve the birds and kill some of those little mites. And I found this knife in the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences archives. And this is one of the knives Bond used in the field. And if you can look at it closely, etched on the blade is "for flesh only." And I guess it's very sharp and you didn't want to break it cutting through bone or something. But when I saw "for flesh only," all I could think of is Ian Fleming could have used that as a title for one of his books, a 007 novel, "For Flesh Only." The other tool of his trade was a double-barreled shotgun. Ironically, one of the big criticisms of Bond as an ornithologist was he didn't kill enough birds. He didn't collect enough birds because these days, these collections of bird skins and all the big natural history museums around the world are just laden with information about the birds at the time, what the environment was like, how many birds there were in a species, how rare it was. And since Bond didn't shoot enough birds, they wish there was more of these little time capsules to learn from. So Finally, in 1936, Jim Bond writes Birds of the West Indies. He went to Joe Lippincott, a very well-known Philadelphia publisher, and said, hey, I've got this great book. Would you publish it for me? And Joe Lippincott replied, sorry, this is something for the museums, not for a publisher. Well, turns out that the book and its various editions stayed in print for more than 6 decades. I think from like the 30s all the way into the 21st century. And I started collecting the different volumes, and they go for a pretty penny these days, because that 007 connection, I'm sure, is part of it. So when I'm researching the book, I didn't realize when I started, but I did it as a lark. I did a search on ornithologists and spies. And to my total surprise, there were at least 7 of Bond's colleagues, 7 Americans, who worked for the OSS or the US Army as spies during World War II. These guys were not, desk jockeys by any stretch of the imagination. I wanted to tell you about 2 of them here, because they're both from the Field Museum in Chicago, and I thought you'd get a kick out of this. The first guy is Rudyard Bolton, and he was a museum ornithologist in New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, who became a specialist in the birds of Africa. He published little aside from Traveling with the Birds, which is a delightful, plain-spoken 1933 children's book about bird migration. So you don't really expect him to turn out to be a spy. But with the onset of World War II, Bolton left his job at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago and joined the OSS, which is the forerunner of the CIA. He became head of the Secret Intelligence Desk for Africa and was connected to the top secret import of Congolese uranium for the Manhattan Project atomic bomb development. Another prime mission was to keep tabs on German operatives in Africa and prevent the Nazis from smuggling that uranium out of the Congo for their own bomb. After the war, Bolton apparently was not eager to get back to museum work. In Look Over My Shoulder, Richard Helms of the CIA wrote about the transition from the OSS. And he said, the morning the termination order was announced at General Donovan's staff meeting, Rudyard Bolton, a soft-spoken, internationally known ornithologist specializing in Africa, shot up from his chair. Thrusting his arms heavenward, he shouted, Jesus H. Christ, I suppose this means that it's back to those goddamn birds. So he's one spy who preferred staying as a spy. The OSS efforts in Africa were quite successful. It turned out that this was the key to the Manhattan Project, was getting the uranium out to America and the Manhattan Project and keeping it out of the hands of the Nazis. So this is a guy from Chicago, pretty big deal. The other guy, and this is a picture of Rudd Bolton in the field, and he's skinning a bird there, and I guess he grew tired of it after the war. This guy is Emmett Snaky Blake, and he is my favorite of all the 7 ornithologist spies. He was another counterpart of Bond's at the Field Museum, and he grew up in South Carolina with a fascination for birds and a penchant for carrying reptiles in his pockets, which earned him the nickname Snaky. He entered the Presbyterian College of South Carolina as a 15-year-old, and after graduating, he roller skated 900 miles to become a part-time grad student at the University of Pittsburgh. He took a year off from his studies and went to the Amazon with National Geographic, where he was bottle washer, cook, and bird skinner, and really developed his ability as an ornithologist. Blake joined the Field Museum in 1935 and became a curator of birds. The interest in birds got him into the US Army counterintelligence in World War II. Blake was sent to North Africa, where he worked his way into Europe, ferreting out German spies who had infiltrated American troops. He also helped track down a truckload of Gestapo-held gold bullion in Bavaria and received a Bronze Star for his efforts. After the war, Blake returned to the Field Museum and in 1953 published The Birds of Mexico, which is the Mexican equivalent of the Birds of the West Indies. And he claimed that despite his many expeditions, he never went on an adventure. A professional doesn't take adventures, said Mr. Blake. To have an adventure is to admit stupidity and incompetence. We prefer to call these close calls acts of God. And as Blake once told the Chicago Tribune, there's not much similarity between hunting birds and hunting spies, except that each requires careful planning. So those are two guys from Chicago that were great spies for the United States during World War II. One other little side note was Emmett Blake actually did a pamphlet on how to preserve birds, and some of them were given out to GIs in Europe. The book is sort of tragically hilarious. He advises amateur ornithologists to clean their birds with carbon tetrachloride and preserve them with arsenic. And all the chemicals he suggests using are on the dangerous substances list. So I guess times change and ornithology isn't quite as dangerous as it once was. So I'm researching the book and I discover all these guys are spies and they're all buddies of Jim Bond's. They name birds for each other. I read Bond's correspondence. He talks about Emmett Blake and Rudd Bolton, Dylan Ripley and these other guys. And so I wondered, was James Bond a spy himself? And I went down to the National Archives and I found all kinds of records about Rudd Bolton and the other guys and found nothing on Jim Bond. And so I said, well, that's a blind alley. I'm going to forget it. And then I was doing searches on Bond's travels. I wanted to find out where and when he went places. And in the May of 1941, I find that Jim Bond is the first guy listed on a trip on the SS America. And it is the most fanciest, fastest, most expensive cruise ship in the world at the time. And I'm going, Jim Bond, the guy who travels on banana boats and cruise ships, is going to the Caribbean on the SS America? That doesn't make sense. So I do a search on SS America and spies, and I find out that at least 2 crewmen and possibly 3 on the SS America during that cruise were part of the Duquesne spy ring, which is the huge Nazi spy ring. It's the largest in American history. The one guy was named the Butcher, the other was the Baker, and at the end of the cruise, they were sent to prison. They were tried and sent to prison for espionage. And about a week later, the SS America got painted, camouflage, and it was turned into a troop ship. And for the rest of World War II, it ferried troops to from North America to Europe, and then later to Japan. So it played a key role in the war. It was this huge ship that could carry 800 to 900 troops at a time. So it was invaluable to the war effort. And when it was built in 1939, the war was on the horizon, and they planned to make this a troop ship. So you wonder, what was Bond doing on the ship with the spies, et cetera, et cetera? So I decided I would file a Freedom of Information Act request. I wrote to the CIA and asked them if they had any knowledge, any record of the real James Bond being a spy. Didn't hear for a couple of months, and I finally get this letter from the CIA. It's about 3 pages long, but this is just a little part of it. Bottom line is they said they can neither confirm nor deny that the subject was a spy for the United States. So we still don't know. I went to the National Archives, said I got this letter from the CIA, and what does it mean? And they said, you know, in 2 years, you may get a big packet of information that says James Bond really was a spy or not. So I guess the jury's still out on that. After the war, Jim Bond got married, and he married a terrific author, and she became his biggest fan and publicist. And about this time, he was getting married. Ian Fleming is getting married in Goldeneye in Jamaica. And he's nervous before the wedding, and he writes his first 007 novel, Dr. No. He needs a name for his secret agent. And he looks down at his desk and sees the name James Bond on the Birds of the West Indies and pretty much steals it. And this is Ian Fleming's desk at Goldeneye, where he reportedly wrote all the books. I found this interview with Ian Fleming with Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and he explains how he got the name.
Mr. Fleming, how does an author tackle the problem of selecting a name for the hero of his stories?
Well, it's even over the hero. I mean, I generally pick up names just driving through the countryside, through villages and so on. You see an interesting name over a tobacconist or chemist or something of that sort in any country in the world. But when I started to write these books in 1952, I wanted to find a name which wouldn't have any of the romantic overtones like Peregrine Carruthers or whatever it might be. I wanted a really flat, quiet name. And one of my Bibles out here is James Bond's Birds of the West Indies, which is a very famous ornithological book indeed. And I thought, well, now James Bond, now that's a pretty quiet name. And so I simply stole it and used it.
And that's how he got his name. The only trouble was he stole the name, but Bond didn't become popular in the United States for another decade. And it wasn't until John Kennedy came to office and told Life magazine one of his 10 favorite books was From Russia with Love. And it was about this time that James Bond and Mary Bond started getting calls late at night from breathless females who would say, "Hello, is James there?" And they couldn't figure out what was going on until a friend of theirs said, "Hey, you know, Ian Fleming stole your husband's name for this womanizing, hard-drinking secret agent." And then they realized what all these late night calls were about. And she wrote to Ian Fleming and said, "Hey, you stole my husband's name, and this is terrible. What are you going to do about it?" And Fleming actually invited them to Goldeneye, and they dropped in unexpectedly about 6 months before Fleming died. And that's a picture Mary Bond took of Ian Fleming on the right, Jim Bond on the left. And the first thing Ian Fleming said to Bond was, "You aren't here to sue me, are you?" And Bond said, "No, I really don't like your books. I'm sort of here to make my wife happy." So the two hit it off, and they stayed all day. And at the end of the day, Ian Fleming pulled out, the book was about to be published, and signed it to the real James Bond from the thief of his identity, Ian Fleming, February 5th, 1964, a great day. And so since Ian Fleming stole James Bond's identity, I thought I'd steal the title from the book from Ian Fleming himself. And so there you have it. So Mary Bond did so much to popularize this ornithological connection. She started writing books about her husband. And this one's called How 007 Got His Name. And it's the only book I know where the spouse uses their spouse's name. So it's by Mrs. James Bond, which is just crazy to me. She also wrote a book called James Bond with Love. And she took James Bond to the doctor in the 1980s and said to the doctor, "Hey, I've got a new book I've written about my husband, James Bond. Would you like a copy?" And the doctor says, "Yeah, sure." So as Mary Bond's leaving, she says, "Oh, here's your signed copy of To James Bond with Love. That'll be $15. And it turns out that the book cost $15, but it's now worth between $250 and $300 because the Mary Bond signature. So the doctor got the last laugh on that one. So James Bond's this famous ornithologist, and he discovers the last known Eskimo curlew, a an ornithologist in the Barbados found it, said, I've got a really strange looking bird here. And Bond said, could you put it in the freezer and save it for me? So 8 months later, he gets to the Barbados, he looks at the bird, says, oh my goodness, this is an extinct Eskimo curlew. And it was a really big deal. And in the past, when Bond would make a discovery like this, it would be in Scientific American or the American Ornithological Society, one of those publications, maybe the Smithsonian. And since he has this James Bond 007 connection, Bond finds himself in all the newspapers across the country with the 007 connection hounding him again. And you can see this is a sample, you know, James Bond nabs a rare old bird. His name is James Bond. This one's for the, and went on and on and on. And Bond really got sick and tired of the 007 connection. Bond died in 1989, and he was probably rolling in his grave when this movie came out. I think this one's called To Die Another Day, 2002. And it's Pierce Brosnan and Halle Berry. And that's Pierce Brosnan walking into a hotel carrying a Birds of the West Indies. And then if you go to the movie itself, this is the scene that really cemented the relationship between ornithologist and 007. He's one of the few ornithologists who smokes a cigar while looking through binoculars. It's a learned trick. It's a shorebird in breeding plumage, I believe. And I apologize for the corny dialogue coming up.
Magnificent view.
It is, isn't it? Too bad it's lost on everybody else.
Ojito? You should try.
Jacinta Johnson. Our friends call me Jinx.
My friends call me James Bond. Jinx, you say?
Born on Friday the 13th.
You believe in bad luck?
Let's just say our relationships don't seem to last.
The feeling. Predators usually appear at sunset.
And why is that?
It's when their prey comes out to drink. Too strong for you?
I can learn to like it, if I have the time.
How much time have you got?
Until dawn. What about you?
Oh, I'm just here for the birds. Ornithologist.
Ah.
So that sort of cemented the Bond 007 relationship. The other thing that Bond hated, besides being linked to 007, was he was a bit of a snob when it came to birding, and he did not like being called a bird watcher. In an interview, he says, really, I'm not a bird watcher at all, not a bit. I'm a bird catcher and a bird collector. So, you know, I said, I'm not sure I'm buying that. And I went through some of the diaries, and I found Mary Bond's bird list from 1956 from their home in Chestnut Hill, Pennsylvania. I'm sure Bond was there helping with these because they're both expert birders, and I'm sure that he enjoyed looking at them as much as she did. I know he's been birding at, he went to Barnegat Light in New Jersey to look for a lesser blackback gull, which sounds pretty much like a birder to me. And he'd go to Hawk Mountain and watch the fall migration, which also pretty much basic bird watcher. So one of the things I tried to come to grips with when I wrote the book was, what is Bond's legacy? And aside from that 007 connection, Bond discovered not only the Eskimo curlew, but he found the Bahama nuthatch, and he thought it was the same, the same species as the brown nuthatch in South Carolina, but he noted there were several differences between them. And in recent years, they're a big debate. They're thinking of making the Bahama nuthatch its own species. And that's the good news. The bad news is, as Bond predicted, it's gone extinct because of all the hurricanes that hit the Bahamas. Bahamas are really low islands, and he worried about all the rare birds in the Bahamas for that reason. And they had 2 bad hurricanes one year after the other, and I don't think a Bahama nuthatch has been found since then. Bond collected many amazing critters for science, including fish. Anything he had his hands on, he collected. And I think this is a grasshopper or a cricket that he collected, and he has a cricket and a stink bug named for him. So talk about impressive resume. He also collected harpy eagle eggs when he went on an expedition to Brazil. And when I saw this, I go, what? He collected harpy eagle eggs, and he hired a young guy to climb a tree 80 feet high and got these eggs out of the tree for science. And these are the only known harpy eagle eggs hatched in the wild in all the major museums in the world. So these are quite significant, and it's pretty cool that they were preserved. And I went online and got this picture of them. They're in a big egg collection in California. The other thing was Bond popularized the birds of the West Indies for generations of travelers, and it is amazing how many people were influenced by his books. That's that red-billed streamer tail that was on the cover of For Your Eyes Only. Also called the doctor bird. They said it had the long tail like a doctor's coat in Jamaica. Klingklings play a big role in The Man with the Golden Gun, if you've read that. And when I went to Goldeneye twice, and Goldeneye is now this really fancy resort. If you stay in the Ian Fleming condo, it's $5,800 a night. So I go down to the bar by the swimming pool, and there are the Klingklings unrolling the napkins on the tables. So I think it was pretty cool the birds are still allowed to hang out there just like they did in Ian Fleming's day. The Bahama parrot, they were thought to be extinct, and Bond found a colony. He hitched a ride on a rum runner to get to this island and then discovered all these birds. The Cuban toady is one of my favorites. I took that picture. I was trying to get pictures of some of the rare Bahama, some of the Zapata birds, and this toady landed right in front of me. I took the picture. And that bird is the same bird as the cover of the Birds of the West Indies. And Bond is such a bird nerd that on the cover, he actually has the nest hole for the bird on the cover. I don't know how many field guides have like the nesting site of birds on the cover as well as the bird itself. The bee hummingbird's the smallest bird in the world, and Bond helped popularize that as well. That's in Cuba, and I saw one when I was down there. Bond also championed the protection of birds in the West Indies. And in his first introduction, 1936, he talked about forests being cut down for plantations. He talked about the wholesale slaughter of birds by local hunters. He championed the creation of parks where hunting was illegal, went on and on like that. And it was really quite something for 1936. And in that introduction in 1936, he wrote, "There can be no doubt the principal factor that has resulted in the extinction or rarity of so many West Indian birds is man." And the next edition of a field guide, he has the ivory-billed woodpecker on the back. And I don't think anyone who bought that book ever saw an ivory-billed woodpecker, but he was so in love with that bird, he put it on the back of the cover anyway. I found this out after the book came out. Joe Wonderly is the editor of the magazine of Caribbean Ornithology, the Journal of Caribbean Ornithology, and he went to the West Indies because he met James Bond and said, where can I study the certain bird? And Bond told him to go to Grenada, and he could study the nesting habits of this bird in Grenada. While he was down there, the United States invaded Grenada, and the Grenada authorities called him in and accused him of being a spy. So sort of goes full circle here. But that's part of Bond's legacy, inspired a lot of people to become birders and even ornithologists. And finally, part of his legacy, he brought us all here tonight to celebrate the West Indies and beautiful birds and share some stories together, I hope, when the talk is over. So, are you a birder, a bonder, or both? I hope I've won some converts for both sides. So thanks for listening. And I'm gonna put up that is my book blog. It has some information on ordering my book. And I can sign it, inscribe it any way you like, and send it on your way. So I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. And if anyone has any questions, we'll give it a shot here.
Well, thank you, Jim. That was phenomenal. And I mean, I'd love to read the book, but after hearing that Audible, segment, I think that's what I'm going to have to do because it was awesome. Please put your questions in chat. There's a couple that I will read. First of all, there were 2 comments that Snakey looks like Humphrey Bogart.
Yes. You know, I think he was wrong. I think that Humphrey Bogart looks like Snakey, but that's just me.
And I was asking, where is Goldeneye, and where did you find that wonderful inscription of Fleming to Bond?
So Goldeneye is on the north coast of Jamaica, and Ian Fleming was in Jamaica for a submarine conference during World War II, and his friend, he fell in love with Jamaica, and he told his friend, if you ever find a place where I could, spend a few months a year while I'm doing my writing, I would love it. So his friend Ivar Bryce finds this former donkey racing race course, and they built this little bungalow there with no windows, and the birds flew in and out. And Fleming wrote all 12 novels and 2 collections of short stories there. And now it's this really fancy, ultra expensive resort. And, Beyonce goes there and all these famous people.
Impressive. And where did you find that Fleming's inscription? Was that in his, the archive that you talked about?
So, that was part of the book. The book was You Only Live Twice. Mary Bond owned it, and she gave it to the Free Library of Philadelphia. And I'm doing the research, and I look at all the things she's donated to the Free Library, and it says, we don't have it. It's donated, but we don't know what happened to it. And they did some research and found it was sold at auction. And a long story short, some friend of Mary Bond said, hey, that book signed by Ian Fleming to your husband's worth a lot of money. You should auction it off. So she borrowed the book back from the Free Library and then sold it at auction. And it eventually sold for $74,000 to an anonymous bidder. And instead of people being able to see this historic book, which is really famous, it's now in the collection of a private individual. And I said it's on their bookshelf for his or her eyes only. And I get an email via Facebook, and the guy says, I think you want to talk to me. I'm the guy who owns the book. And he's a big Bond collector, lives in the United States, and he owns the book. And he's been a really good guy and helped me with all kinds of things. And he had no idea that Mary Bond had stolen the book when he bought it. So
what a thrill as a researcher to get that email. Wow.
Yeah, okay. I got goosebumps. It was great.
I'm sure. Okay, next question was, this is interesting. Were ornithologists recruited as spies because they had a legitimate reason to travel?
I think that was one of the reasons. So the reasons I came across, one was these guys, almost all of them had been to the places where they were being sent. So they were known there. They knew the customs. They knew the officials. They can walk around carrying binoculars and shotguns, and no one thinks twice. And they have great observation skills. They blend in. There's a ton of them.
Sorry, I just got a cramp in my leg. Sonny, take over for a second.
All right.
I'm fine. I'm back. That's funny.
So next question is Mary still living?
No, she died a couple years after James Bond did. It was a really great love story. They fell in love when they were in their 50s, and they lived into their 80s and just were happily married, as far as I can tell, the whole time. So it was a pretty cool story.
I wonder, was she a birder before she met him?
Not
a bird collector.
You know, she was a writer, and she did an article for Audubon magazine, and this is in the 30s or 40s, and interviewed Jim Bond. And she was married at the time, but I think a light bulb went off. And after her husband died, they got together. There is a novel she wrote called The Petrified Gesture. And it's a bit of a bodice ripper. And the heroine gets the hots for an ornithologist who sounds a lot like James Bond.
Okay. I don't know how many of the people on this call have been to Cuba, but looking at the picture of the Cuba toady, Sonny and I were there, maybe 8 years ago, and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else has questions. I wanted to also ask how long it took you to research and write the book.
You know, I wrote a column for the newspaper about the real James Bond, and I started digging into a book possibility, and that was in November 2015. So I've worked on it for about 3.5 years, and then I've been waiting for the movie to come out. I was ready to have the book published. I said, it doesn't matter, the 007 movie, it's not important to me, but apparently it was to the publisher. And
you were waiting.
Yeah, they waited a year. Well, they've been waiting a year. It will be a year and a half now.
They waited just until the pandemic hit, right?
Yeah. Well, the movie was supposed to come out.
Yeah, I understand.
And that was the first sign that things were really going to be bad, because out of the blue, the James Bond movie was postponed. And everyone's going, why are they postponing the movie? What are they, nuts? And now they've had to postpone it again. And I don't know. It certainly changed how I talking about books. You know, I had all these talks lined up, and I would show up and sign books and get to see everybody. And I did not even hear of Zoom when the book came out. And now it's a godsend. And I'm able to talk to you guys in Chicago. I did a talk in British Columbia, Denver, in Great Britain. And I get to see faces too. And if you just do a talk, you really don't see people like this. And when people order the book, I often write to them and find out little things too. An occasional relative like Jamie even. So it's been a lot of fun, and I've just learned so much.
Yeah, I always say it's the silver lining of the pandemic that we can at least, you know, like all our programs, Lake Cook programs, have been long distance people who we couldn't have otherwise. Got a question. Did James or Mary have a favorite bird?
Ooh, well, as you know, James Bond was not a bird watcher. He collected birds and shot them, he said. I'm not sure. I think it's a Cuban toady because it was on the cover of 2 of his books. And if you've ever seen the red-billed streamer tail, that had to be a favorite as well. That is one spectacular bird. If you get a chance, read the collection of short stories For Your Eyes Only, and read the first 3 paragraphs of the story by Ian Fleming. It's nothing but a description of the red-billed streamer tail. It's beautiful.
Did you tell us why or how he got interested in birds?
I think as a kid, he liked birds a lot. His father went on one of those really expensive expeditions to Brazil and came back, and it was his claim to fame that he went on this expedition. I think Bond sort of understood that if you want to make a name for yourself, you need to do extraordinary things, and he did.
Well, anyone else? I've got the illustrations shown in the books are beautiful. Shall we put up, let's see, realjamesbond.net, right? realjamesbond.net for anybody who wants to go there. And
you may need a www, but that's it. And if you look around, I posted some of James Bond's licenses to kill this week or last week. And there's all kinds of little neat things like that about the real James Bond, some 007 stuff. And if you just scroll around, you'll see stuff in the Bahama Nuthatch, all kinds of things.
Yeah, real James Bond, and he keeps adding things. And you said, Jim, also you'll be adding more things close to when the movie comes out as well.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Unless anybody else has anything else,
I'm going to unmute all. We can all, everybody can give Jim a little bit of a round of applause.
Yes.
I think you're muted. Oh, no, okay.
Fantastic, thank you.
Everybody, thank you. A lot of good questions.
Thank you. It was great.
Tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. We knew this would be a fun night.
Yeah, presenting it. Thank you for arranging it.
Yeah. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Jim. That's splendid.
Thank you.
Great to meet you, Jim. It's on Skype, on Zoom.
Thanks very much.
What all the people.
Thank you.
Hello to all the people I didn't say hello to. Hello and goodbye.
Goodbye. It was really quite wonderful. Very entertaining.
Well, yeah, Libby and I actually saw him on, a short YouTube clip, so we knew it would be, right, Libby?
Yes, we're right. We were smitten immediately. we looked at other things.
Yeah.
We looked at other things and said, no, that's, that doesn't strike us as being wonderful, but this really sounded like a good story, and we liked him.
It was a unanimous vote of 2.
Yes.
Well, I hope that everyone or some of you support him by ordering the book or whatever. It was very wonderful of him to speak to us, and it was fun. And who knew, right? So.
Well, he wanted to come to Chicago. That was the big thing.
Yeah.
At that time, it seemed like it might be possible to come to Chicago, although a long shot. But that was one of his first reactions was, my wife and I have been wanting to come to Chicago.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
someday.
Yeah,
we'll do it. Yeah. So that was, it just turned out really wonderfully, I think. Very entertaining.
Thank you, Sonny. Thanks for arranging.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Very colorful story. So be well, everyone, and hope to see some of you soon.
Okay.
In person, maybe. I keep saying with the field trips, I'm glad to see the birds and I'm glad to see the birders. So.
Yes, and that's it. That's the important thing is that we can still have field trips. There's nothing stopping those. The more the merrier here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Night, everybody.
Night.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
I'm going to end the meeting. See you all.
Okay. So long, son.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again, Libby.
See you guys.
Hey, Rena and Sonny, it's been a pleasure working with you. It's really been fun. We got to do it again.
Okay. We're done. See you later. Bye, guys. Bye.